The familiar scent of coffee and rain hit me as I stepped off the plane at Portland International Airport. It had been 2 years since I'd been home, and the Pacific Northwest hadn't changed. Gray clouds hung low over the city, and the air carried that distinctive smell of wet pavement and evergreen trees that I'd missed more than I cared to admit. I pulled my coat tighter around me as I walked through the terminal, my graduation cap still slightly crooked in my carry-on bag. Just 3 days ago, I'd walked across that stage at Georgetown University, my master's degree in public administration finally in hand. 2 years of sleepless nights, research papers, and internships at community organizations had led to this moment. Coming home to Portland with big dreams and even bigger plans. My parents had sent a single text message after my graduation photos. "Congratulations. Safe travels home." No phone call, no celebration, just those cold words that somehow managed to sting worse than complete silence would have. The ride from the airport to my childhood neighborhood in southeast Portland took me through familiar streets lined with food trucks and vintage shops. Everything looked smaller than I remembered, but maybe that was just because I'd spent 2 years in Washington, D.C., where everything felt monumental and important. Here, life moved at a different pace. People walked their dogs without checking phones. Neighbors actually talked to each other over garden fences. I directed the Uber driver to stop in front of a modest 2-story house with a wraparound porch and a garden that my mother had maintained religiously for as long as I could remember. The roses were in full bloom despite the October chill, and the lawn was perfectly manicured. This was home, even if it didn't feel like it anymore. Before I could even knock, the front door opened. Mom stood there in her familiar apron, the one with little strawberries printed on it that she'd worn every Sunday for as long as I could remember. Her graying hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Nick," she said, stepping aside to let me in. "How was your flight?" "Long," I replied, setting my suitcase down in the entryway. The house smelled like cinnamon and vanilla, the same candles she'd always burned. Family photos lined the hallway walls, but I noticed that most of them were from before I'd left for college. It was like the last 7 years of my life had been carefully edited out. Dad emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel. At 55, he still had the broad shoulders and calloused hands of someone who'd built his business from the ground up. Miller's Family Restaurant had been his life's work, and it showed in everything from his posture to the way he talked about real work and practical solutions. "There she is," he said, and I could hear the forced cheerfulness in his voice. "Our college graduate. Come on back to the kitchen." I followed them into the familiar space where I'd spent countless hours doing homework while Mom prepped vegetables and Dad worked on the books. The kitchen table was set for 2, not 3. "We already ate," Mom explained quickly, noticing my glance. "We didn't know exactly when you'd arrive. It was barely 6 o'clock, and they always used to eat dinner at 7, but I didn't say anything. Instead, I pulled out one of the chairs and sat down, feeling suddenly exhausted. "So," Dad said, settling into his chair across from me, "what's the plan now? You going to look for a real job, or—" There it was. Less than 10 minutes home, and we were already having this conversation. "I have a real job, Dad. I've been working with the Community Development Corporation in D.C., and I'm hoping to do something similar here. Maybe work with the city, help develop programs for food security and affordable housing." Mom set a plate in front of me. "Leftover meatloaf from the restaurant, probably." "That's nice, honey, but those government jobs don't pay much. And with your student loans—" "I'm not worried about the money," I said, taking a bite. The food was good, but it felt like chewing cardboard. "I want to make a difference. I want to help people." Dad leaned back in his chair, and I recognized the expression on his face. It was the same one he'd worn when I told him I was changing my major from business to public policy. The same one when I'd announced I was going to graduate school instead of coming home to help with the restaurant. "Nick," he said, and his voice had that patient tone that meant he was about to explain something he thought I was too naive to understand. "Helping people is all well and good, but you can't eat good intentions. Your mother and I, we built something real here. We employ 12 people, we serve the community, we pay our taxes. That's how you make a difference." I set down my fork. "I'm not saying what you do isn't important, but you're not interested in it," Mom interrupted, her voice sharper than usual. "You've made that clear. You'd rather chase after some government job that might not even exist than help with the family business." The silence stretched between us, filled with years of unspoken disappointment and misunderstanding. I looked around the kitchen, at the copper pots hanging from hooks, at the window that overlooked the backyard where I'd played as a child. This should have felt like home, but instead it felt like a museum of a life I'd outgrown. "I'm going to unpack," I said finally, standing up. "Thanks for dinner." As I climbed the stairs to my old bedroom, I could hear them talking in low voices in the kitchen. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was familiar, the same one they'd used when discussing my impractical choices throughout college. My room was exactly as I'd left it, down to the high school photos on the dresser and the faded poster of the Oregon coast on the wall. It felt like stepping back in time, but not in a comforting way. It felt like being trapped in a version of myself that I'd outgrown. I sat on the edge of my childhood bed and pulled out my phone, scrolling through the contacts until I found the number I was looking for. Dr. Rebecca Chen had been my thesis advisor at Georgetown, and she'd given me the contact information for several organizations in Portland before I left. Remember, she'd told me during our last meeting, change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without resistance. Sometimes the people who should support you the most are the ones who understand you the least. I stared at the phone number for the Portland Community Alliance, a grassroots organization that worked on food security issues. Tomorrow, I would start building the life I wanted, even if it meant doing it without my parents' support. Outside my window, the rain had started again, pattering against the glass like a gentle reminder that I was home. But home, I was beginning to realize, wasn't just a place. It was something you had to create for yourself. The Portland Community Alliance office was nothing like the polished nonprofit spaces I'd worked in during my internships in D.C. Located in a converted warehouse in the Alberta Arts District, it had concrete floors, exposed brick walls, and the kind of mismatched furniture that screamed, donated from someone's garage sale. But there was something alive about the place. Bulletin boards covered with community event flyers, whiteboards filled with meeting notes, and the constant hum of people who actually cared about making things better. I'd called ahead and spoken to Maria Santos, the executive director, who'd agreed to meet with me that Tuesday morning. She was a woman in her 40s with silver-streaked black hair and the kind of confident handshake that told you she'd fought for everything she'd achieved. "So you're Dr. Chen's student," she said, leading me to a small office that overlooked the street. "She spoke very highly of your work on food access policy. What brings you back to Portland?" I settled into the chair across from her desk, which was covered with grant applications and community surveys. "I want to come home and actually do something with what I learned. I've been researching food insecurity in urban areas, and I think there's real potential here to create sustainable solutions." Maria nodded, leaning forward with interest. "Tell me more." For the next hour, I explained my ideas about mobile food pantries, community gardens, and partnerships with local restaurants to reduce food waste. I showed her the research I'd done on Portland's food desert areas, particularly in Southeast Portland, where many families struggle to access fresh, affordable groceries. "This is exactly what we need," Maria said when I finished. "We've been working on food security issues for years, but we need someone with your policy background to help us scale up. The thing is, we don't have funding for a full-time position right now." "I'm not worried about the money," I said, surprising myself with how quickly I responded. "I can volunteer while I look for other work, or maybe we can apply for grants together." Maria smiled. "I like your attitude. When can you start?" By Thursday, I was officially a volunteer coordinator for the Portland Community Alliance, working out of a shared desk in the main office. The team was small but passionate. There was James, a recent college graduate who managed their social media, Sarah, a retired teacher who coordinated volunteers, and Marcus, a former chef who ran their nutrition education programs. "The thing about food insecurity," Marcus explained during my first day, "is that it's not just about hunger. It's about dignity, about community, about having choices. When someone has to choose between paying rent and buying groceries, that's not a personal failing. That's a systemic problem." I found myself nodding along, remembering the academic theories I'd studied coming to life in real conversations with real people. This was what I'd been missing in all those policy papers and research projects: the human element, the faces behind the statistics. That weekend, I decided to visit some of the neighborhoods we'd identified as having the highest need. I drove through areas of Southeast Portland where corner stores sold mostly processed foods, and the nearest full-service grocery store was a 20-minute bus ride away. I talked to residents, business owners, and community leaders, taking notes and trying to understand the real challenges people faced. On Saturday afternoon, I found myself at a community center in the Jade District, where a group of elderly Vietnamese residents were discussing transportation issues. Mrs. Nguyen, who ran the center, translated for me as several people explained how difficult it was to get to affordable grocery stores. "The bus stop's running early," she explained, "and many of our elders don't drive. They depend on family members or pay for expensive taxi rides just to buy food." I scribbled notes furiously, my mind already racing with possibilities. What if we could coordinate mobile markets? What if we could work with existing cultural centers to create food distribution hubs? When I got home that evening, I found my parents in the living room watching television. They looked up as I walked in, and I could see the question in their eyes. How was your first week? Mom asked, her voice carefully neutral. Really good, I said, settling into the chair across from them. I'm working with the Portland Community Alliance on food access issues. Did you know that over 40,000 people in Portland live in food deserts? Dad muted the television. What's a food desert? Areas where people don't have easy access to fresh, affordable food, like the neighborhoods around 82nd Avenue or parts of Southeast Portland. People have to travel miles just to buy groceries, or they rely on convenience stores that don't carry healthy options. People have been getting by just fine, Dad said, his voice taking on that dismissive tone I'd heard before. If they want groceries, they can figure out how to get them. It's not that simple, Dad. If you're working 2 jobs and don't have a car and the only store in walking distance charges $3 for a gallon of milk that costs $2.50 at Safeway, life's not fair, he interrupted. People need to work harder, make better choices. I felt something tight in my chest, a familiar frustration that had been building for years. What if it's not about individual choices? What if it's about systems that make it harder for some people to access basic necessities? Mom set down her knitting and looked at me with what I could only describe as pity. Nick, honey, you're talking about people like they can't take care of themselves. That's not helping anyone. I'm talking about removing barriers so people can take care of themselves, I said, hearing my voice rise despite my efforts to stay calm. There's a difference between helping people and enabling them, and there's a difference between believing in personal responsibility and ignoring structural inequality. Dad picked up the remote and unmuted the television. Well, when you figure out how to solve all the world's problems, let us know. The dismissal stung more than I wanted to admit. I got up and headed for the kitchen, ostensibly to get a glass of water, but really to give myself space to breathe. As I stood at the sink, I could hear them talking quietly in the living room. She's got to learn that the world doesn't work the way she thinks it does, Dad was saying. Give her time, Mom replied. Maybe she'll come around when she realizes how hard it actually is. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. They weren't trying to be cruel, I told myself. They just didn't understand. But understanding had to go both ways, and right now it felt like they weren't even trying to see what I was working toward. My phone buzzed with a text from Maria. Great work today. The city council member for Southeast Portland wants to meet with you next week. This could be big. I smiled despite everything. Maybe my parents didn't understand what I was doing, but other people did. And maybe, just maybe, I was starting to find my real community in Portland. Not the one I'd been born into, but the one I was choosing to build. Outside, the rain had started again. But this time it didn't feel like a reminder of limitations. It felt like the beginning of something new growing. The meeting with City Council member Jennifer Walsh was scheduled for Thursday morning at her office in City Hall. I'd spent the entire week preparing, creating a presentation that outlined our food access initiative and included detailed maps of Portland's food deserts, survey data from community members, and a preliminary budget for mobile food markets. Jennifer was younger than I'd expected, maybe in her early 40s. With short auburn hair and the kind of sharp business attire that suggested she took her role seriously. Her office walls were covered with photos from community events and certificates from various civic organizations. Maria Santos speaks very highly of your work, she said, gesturing for me to sit across from her desk. She says you have some innovative ideas about addressing food insecurity in Southeast Portland. I opened my laptop and began walking her through the presentation. As I talked about transportation barriers, pricing disparities, and the correlation between food access and health outcomes, I could see her taking notes and asking increasingly detailed questions. This is impressive research, she said when I finished. But I have to ask, what's your timeline? And more importantly, what do you need from the city to make this happen? We're hoping to launch a pilot program within 3 months, I said. We need permits for the mobile markets, coordination with existing food assistance programs, and ideally some funding for a part-time coordinator position. Jennifer leaned back in her chair, considering. The mayor's been talking about food equity as a priority. This could be exactly what we need to show real progress on the issue. Can you put together a more detailed proposal for the next city council meeting? I tried to keep my expression professional, but inside I was practically vibrating with excitement. Absolutely. When is the next meeting? 2 weeks from today? And Nick? She stood up, extending her hand. This is exactly the kind of community-driven initiative we need more of. Thank you for bringing this to us. I practically floated out of City Hall and immediately called Maria to share the news. She was equally excited and suggested we meet that afternoon to start working on the formal proposal. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of grant applications, community meetings, and late nights refining our presentation. I spent hours at the Alliance office, working alongside Maria and the rest of the team to create something that could actually change lives. On the Saturday before the city council meeting, We held a community forum at the local library to gather input from residents who would be directly affected by the program. The turnout was better than I'd hoped. About 40 people filled the small meeting room, including families with children, elderly residents, and local business owners. Mrs. Nguyen from the Jade District Community Center spoke about the transportation challenges facing elderly residents. A young mother named Ashley talked about having to choose between buying formula for her baby and fresh vegetables for her older children. A man named David, who worked 2 part-time jobs and didn't have a car, described the hours he spent each week traveling to different stores to find affordable groceries. "This isn't about charity," I said during my closing remarks. "This is about creating systems that work for everyone. Food access is a fundamental need, and when people can't access healthy, affordable food, it affects entire communities." The room erupted in applause, and afterward several people approached me to volunteer or share their contact information. As I packed up my materials, I felt a sense of purpose I'd never experienced before, not even during my most successful academic projects. That evening, I arrived home to find my parents in the kitchen, preparing for the next day's restaurant service. They looked up as I walked in, and I could see Mom taking in my rumpled clothes and probably caffeinated appearance. "You look tired," she said, not unkindly. "I am," I admitted, grabbing a glass of water. "But it's good tired. We're presenting to the city council on Thursday." "That's nice, honey," Mom said, but I could hear the distance in her voice. Dad looked up from the invoice he was reviewing. "What exactly are you presenting?" I took a breath, deciding to try one more time to help them understand. "We're proposing a mobile food market program for underserved neighborhoods. Instead of people having to travel miles to afford groceries, we'd bring fresh, affordable food directly to community centers and schools." "And who's paying for this?" Dad asked. "We're applying for grants, and the city is considering funding a coordinator position. It's actually a really cost-effective way to address food insecurity." Dad set down his pen and looked at me with that familiar expression of patient frustration. "Nick, you're talking about giving people free food. How is that teaching them to be self-sufficient?" "It's not free food," I said, feeling my voice rise despite my efforts to stay calm. "It's about making food accessible. When someone has to spend 3 hours on public transportation and $20 in bus fare to buy groceries, that's not a character issue. That's a systems issue. People have always figured out how to feed their families," Mom said quietly. "Your grandmother raised 6 children during the Depression. She didn't need government programs." I felt something snap inside me. Grandma also lived in a time when you could buy a house on a single income, and when neighborhoods had corner stores that carried actual food instead of just processed junk. "The world has changed, Mom." "Don't take that tone with me," Dad said, standing up. "We work hard for everything we have. We employ people, we contribute to the community, we don't ask for handouts." "Neither do the people I'm trying to help," I shot back. "They're working hard too, sometimes harder than anyone should have to survive." The silence that followed was heavy with years of accumulated misunderstanding. I looked at my parents, really looked at them, and saw 2 people who genuinely believed that individual effort was enough to overcome any obstacle. They weren't cruel or uncaring. They just lived in a world where their own hard work had paid off, and they couldn't understand why the same formula wouldn't work for everyone. "I'm going to bed," I said finally. "The presentation is Thursday at 2 o'clock if you want to come." "We'll be working," Dad said, already turning back to his invoices. As I climbed the stairs to my room, I heard Mom say something quietly to Dad, but I couldn't make out the words. I didn't need to. I knew they were discussing my unrealistic ideals and my failure to understand how the world really works. But lying in bed that night, scrolling through messages from community members who were excited about the mobile market program, I felt more connected to my purpose than ever before. Maybe my parents couldn't see the value in what I was doing, but the people who would benefit from it could. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The city council meeting was in 4 days, and I was ready to fight for something that mattered. The Portland City Council chambers were more intimidating than I'd expected. High ceilings, dark wood paneling, and a semicircular arrangement of seats that made me feel like I was about to defend a dissertation rather than present a community initiative. I sat in the front row with Maria, my hands slightly shaking as I reviewed my notes one final time. "You've got this," Maria whispered, squeezing my shoulder. "Remember, you're not just presenting a program, you're representing the voices of 40 people who showed up to that community forum." The chambers were about half full, mostly with other presenters and a few community members who'd come to support various agenda items. I spotted Mrs. Nguyen sitting 3 rows back, and she gave me an encouraging nod. Ashley, the young mother who'd spoken at our forum, was there too, having arranged childcare just to attend. Mayor Richard Thompson called the meeting to order, and I tried to focus on his opening remarks while my heart hammered in my chest. This was it. The moment when months of research and community organizing would either translate into real change or disappear into bureaucratic indifference. Next item, Mayor Thompson announced, is a proposal for a mobile food market program from the Portland Community Alliance. We'll hear from Ms. Nicole Miller. I stood up on slightly unsteady legs and walked to the podium, my folder clutched tightly in my hands. The 5 council members looked down at me with expressions ranging from polite interest to mild skepticism. Good afternoon, I began, my voice stronger than I'd expected. My name is Nick Miller, and I'm here to present a proposal that could directly impact the lives of thousands of Portland residents who currently struggle with food access. I clicked to my first slide, showing a map of Portland with food deserts highlighted in red. Over 40,000 people in our city live more than a mile from a full-service grocery store. For families without reliable transportation, this means choosing between spending hours and significant money on bus fare or relying on convenience stores that charge premium prices for limited selection. As I continued through the presentation, I felt my confidence growing. This wasn't just academic theory anymore. It was real solutions for real people. I talked about Mrs. Nguyen's elderly community members who couldn't access affordable fresh vegetables, about Ashley having to choose between formula and produce, about David spending his limited free time traveling across the city just to feed his family. Our mobile food market program would bring fresh, affordable groceries directly to community centers, schools, and senior housing facilities, I explained, clicking to a slide showing potential locations. We've identified 12 initial sites that would serve the highest need areas with plans to expand based on community response. Councilmember Walsh leaned forward. What's the funding model for this program? We've secured initial funding through a combination of federal grants and private donations, I said. The city's investment would primarily be in permitting support and potentially a part-time coordinator position. The cost per person served would be approximately $40 annually, significantly less than the health and social costs of food insecurity. Councilmember Davis raised his hand. This sounds like a lot of bureaucracy to solve a problem that people have been handling themselves for generations. Are we creating dependency instead of encouraging self-sufficiency? I felt a flash of frustration. It was the same question my father had asked, phrased almost identically. But this time, I was ready for it. With respect, Councilman Davis, I disagree with the premise of your question, I said, keeping my voice steady. Food access isn't about dependency. It's about removing barriers to self-sufficiency. When someone has to spend 3 hours and $20 in transportation costs to buy groceries, that's not a character issue. That's a structural problem we have the power to solve. I clicked to a slide showing economic data. Research shows that every dollar invested in food access programs generates 1.85 in economic activity. When families can access affordable food in their own neighborhoods, they have more time and money to invest in education, employment, and other opportunities. The room was quiet, and I could see the council members taking notes. Mayor Thompson looked particularly engaged, leaning forward and nodding as I spoke. Furthermore, I continued, this program isn't about handouts. It's about creating access. We're not giving away free food. We're bringing the same grocery options that suburban families take for granted into neighborhoods that have been systematically underserved. I clicked to my final slide, showing photos from our community forum. The people who would benefit from this program aren't asking for charity. They're asking for the same access to healthy, affordable food that should be available to everyone. They're asking for the chance to make real choices about how they feed their families. When I finished, the chamber was silent for a moment. Then Mrs. Nguyen started clapping, followed by Ashley and several other community members. The applause spread through the room, and I felt tears prick at my eyes. Thank you, Ms. Miller, Mayor Thompson said. This is exactly the kind of innovative, community-driven initiative we need more of. I'd like to schedule a follow-up meeting to discuss implementation details. Councilmember Walsh nodded. I motion to approve the permit applications and explore funding options for the coordinator position. Seconded, came from 2 other council members simultaneously. As the vote was called and passed unanimously, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just about the mobile food markets anymore. It was about proving that community organizing could create real change, that policy could be driven by compassion without sacrificing effectiveness. After the meeting, I was surrounded by community members offering congratulations and council staff wanting to discuss next steps. Maria was practically glowing as she introduced me to reporters from the local paper and the community newsletter. This is just the beginning, she said as we walked out of City Hall together. The mayor's office wants to use this as a model for other equity initiatives. You've created something really special here. I drove home in a daze, still processing what had just happened. For the first time since returning to Portland, I felt like I'd found my place, not just in the community, but in the work I was meant to be doing. The house was quiet when I arrived, but I could see lights on in the kitchen. I found my parents finishing dinner, and they looked up as I walked in. "How did it go?" Mom asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Really well," I said, unable to keep the excitement out of my voice. "The city council approved the program unanimously. We're going to start implementation next month." "That's nice, honey," Mom said, but I could hear the distance in her voice. Dad set down his fork. "So now what? You're going to run around playing social worker?" The casual dismissal hit me like a physical blow. Here I was, having just secured funding for a program that would help thousands of people, and my own parents couldn't even pretend to be proud. "I'm going to continue doing work that matters," I said, my voice shakier than I wanted it to be. "I'm going to help people in our community access basic necessities. I'm going to use my education and my skills to make Portland a better place for everyone." "And how exactly are you going to pay rent while you're saving the world?" Dad asked. "The city approved funding for a coordinator position," I said. "I'll be making enough to live on while doing something meaningful." Dad shook his head. "You're 25 years old, Nick. It's time to stop playing at activism and start building a real life." Something inside me snapped. "This is my real life," I said, my voice rising. "This is what I want to do with my time and my talents and my education. I'm sorry it's not what you wanted for me, but I'm not going to apologize for caring about people who don't have everything handed to them." "Nobody handed us anything," Mom said quietly. "We worked for everything we have." "And I'm working too," I said, feeling tears of frustration building. "I'm working to create opportunities for people who haven't had the same advantages we've had. I'm working to build a community where everyone has a chance to succeed, not just the people who were born lucky." The silence that followed was heavy with years of accumulated disappointment. I looked at my parents and saw two people who genuinely couldn't understand why their daughter would choose meaning over money, community over comfort. "I'm going to bed," I said finally. "Tomorrow I start planning how to get fresh food to families who need it. I'm sorry that doesn't meet your definition of success, but it meets mine." As I climbed the stairs, I heard Dad say something to Mom about naive idealism and learning the hard way. But for the first time since I'd come home, their disapproval didn't feel like a weight on my shoulders. It felt like proof that I was finally becoming the person I was meant to be, even if they couldn't see it yet. 3 months later, the mobile food market program was exceeding every expectation we'd set. Our 12 locations were serving over 800 families weekly, and the waiting list for new sites kept growing. The local media had picked up the story, and I'd been interviewed by Oregon Public Broadcasting about community-driven solutions to food insecurity. But the call that changed everything came on a rainy Tuesday morning in February. I was at the Alliance office reviewing survey data from our participating families when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. "Ms. Miller, this is Janet Rodriguez from the mayor's office. Mayor Thompson would like to invite you to a special community leadership dinner next Friday evening. It's part of his initiative to recognize innovative local programs." I nearly dropped my phone. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" "The mayor would like to honor your mobile food market program at a community dinner. It's an outdoor event. We're partnering with several local restaurants to showcase Portland's commitment to food access and community engagement. Would you be available?" After I hung up, I sat staring at my phone for a full minute before Maria walked over to my desk. "Good news or bad news?" she asked, noting my expression. "I think it's good news," I said slowly. "The mayor wants to honor our program at a community dinner on Friday." "Nick, that's incredible!" Maria practically shouted, drawing looks from everyone else in the office. "Do you know what this means? This could bring citywide attention to food access issues." The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. I bought a dress that made me feel professional and confident, practiced my remarks in the mirror, and tried not to think about how surreal this all felt. 6 months ago, I'd been sitting in my childhood bedroom feeling like a disappointment to my parents. Now, I was being honored by the mayor of Portland. Friday evening arrived gray and drizzly. Typical February weather for the Pacific Northwest. The community dinner was being held in Pioneer Courthouse Square, but as I approached downtown, I realized something that made my stomach drop. The event wasn't just near my parents' restaurant. It was directly across the street from Miller's Family Restaurant. Enormous white tents had been set up in the square, with heaters and string lights creating a warm, inviting atmosphere despite the weather. Local restaurants had set up stations offering samples of their specialties, and there were information booths about various community programs. A small stage at one end of the square was decorated with banners reading, "Community Leaders Making a Difference." I checked in at the registration table, where a cheerful volunteer handed me a name tag that read, "Nicole Miller, Portland Community Alliance Food Access Coordinator." Seeing my title printed out like that still felt surreal. "Ms. Miller," I turned to see Mayor Thompson approaching, accompanied by several other officials I recognized from city council meetings. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I hope you're ready to talk about your incredible work. As he led me toward the stage area, I caught sight of Miller's Family Restaurant across the street. The dining room was busy, as always during the Friday dinner rush. Through the large front windows, I could see servers moving between tables and the familiar organized chaos of a successful restaurant in full swing. Before we begin the program, Mayor Thompson said, I want you to meet some folks who are interested in scaling your mobile market model statewide. This is Senator Patricia Williams from the Oregon State Legislature. The next hour passed in a whirlwind of introductions and conversations with state officials, nonprofit leaders, and community organizers from other cities. Everyone wanted to know about our program design, our funding model, and our plans for expansion. I found myself explaining our work with the confidence that came from knowing it was making a real difference. The key, I told a group from Eugene who wanted to start a similar program, is to start with community voices. We didn't design this in an office and impose it on neighborhoods. We listened to what people needed and built something responsive to those needs. As the formal program began, I was asked to join Mayor Thompson and several other honorees on the small stage. Looking out at the crowd of about 200 people, I spotted familiar faces from our community forums, city staff I'd worked with, and media representatives with cameras and notebooks. Tonight, we're celebrating Portland residents who embody our city's commitment to innovation, equity, and community engagement, Mayor Thompson said into the microphone. Our first honoree has created a program that's not just feeding families, it's strengthening neighborhoods and proving that policy can be both compassionate and effective. As he began describing the mobile food market program, I glanced across the street at my parents' restaurant. The dining room was still packed, and I could see my father behind the host stand, probably greeting customers the way he did every Friday night. Nicole Miller came home to Portland with big ideas and the determination to turn them into reality, the mayor continued. In just 6 months, her mobile food market program has served over 800 families, created partnerships with 12 community organizations, and generated a model that other cities are already adopting. The applause was warm and sustained, and I felt a familiar mix of pride and disbelief. When Mayor Thompson handed me the microphone, I looked out at the crowd and tried to find the words that would capture what this work meant to me. 6 months ago, I came home to Portland with a lot of academic knowledge about food policy, but no real understanding of what it meant to build change from the ground up, I began. What I've learned is that communities already know what they need. They just need support to make it happen. I talked about Mrs. Guyen's community center, about Ashley being able to buy fresh vegetables for her children, about David having more time to spend with his family instead of traveling across the city for groceries. As I spoke, I noticed movement in the restaurant across the street. My mother had appeared in the front window, looking out at the event in the square. This program works because it's built on a simple principle, I continued, my voice growing stronger. Everyone deserves access to healthy, affordable food, and when we remove the barriers that prevent that access, entire communities benefit. This isn't about charity, it's about justice. The applause was even louder this time, and I saw several people wiping their eyes. As I handed the microphone back to Mayor Thompson, I noticed that my father had joined my mother at the restaurant window. They were both staring across the street at the stage where their daughter was being honored by the mayor. After the formal program ended, the crowd was invited to continue socializing and sample food from the participating restaurants. I was immediately surrounded by people wanting to congratulate me and ask follow-up questions about the program. A reporter from the Oregonian interviewed me about our plans for expansion, and a representative from the Oregon Food Bank wanted to discuss partnership opportunities. Nick! I turned to see Ashley pushing through the crowd with her 2 children in tow. I can't believe this, you're famous. I laughed and hugged her. I'm not famous, but I'm really glad you came. Are you kidding? After what this program has done for my family? She gestured to her kids, who were happily eating samples from various food stations. Sophia's been eating vegetables all week because we can actually afford them now. I had to come and say thank you. Similar conversations continued throughout the evening. Mrs. Nguyen presented me with a small potted orchid from her community garden. David introduced me to his teenage daughter, who was interested in studying public policy. Over and over, people thanked me for work that felt like the most natural thing in the world. As the event began winding down around 9 o'clock, I found myself standing near the edge of the square, looking across the street at my parents' restaurant. The dinner rush had ended, and I could see the staff cleaning up. The contrast between the two scenes, the celebration of community organizing in the square and the quiet efficiency of the family business across the street, felt symbolic of the gulf between my world and my parents' world. Ms. Miller? I turned to see Mayor Thompson approaching with a small group of officials. Before you leave, I wanted to introduce you to some folks from the governor's office. They're working on a statewide food access initiative, and they'd like to discuss having you consult on the project. The conversation that followed was surreal. State officials were asking for my input on policy development. They wanted to bring me to Salem to present to legislative committees. They were talking about scaling our model across Oregon and potentially partnering with other states. This could be your full-time focus if you're interested, said Deputy Director Sarah Chen from the Oregon Department of Human Services. We're looking for someone to lead our rural food access initiative. The position would be based here in Portland, but involve statewide travel. I tried to process what she was saying. 6 months ago, my parents had dismissed my career as unrealistic idealism. Now the state government wanted me to lead a major policy initiative. I'm definitely interested, I managed to say. Could I have some time to think about it? Of course. Here's my card. Let's schedule a meeting next week to discuss details. As the crowd gradually dispersed and the cleanup crews began breaking down the tents, I found myself standing alone in the square, still trying to process everything that had happened. The string lights were being taken down, but the heaters were still running, creating pockets of warmth in the cool evening air. I looked across the street one more time. Miller's Family Restaurant was almost empty now, with just a few staff members finishing closing duties. As I watched, my parents emerged from the front door together, probably heading home after another successful Friday night. They paused on the sidewalk, and I saw them both look across the street at the remnants of the evening's celebration. For a moment, we were separated by just 2 lanes of traffic and years of misunderstanding. But something felt different. Maybe it was the residual energy from the evening, or maybe it was the confidence that came from knowing I was exactly where I belonged, doing exactly what I was meant to do. I pulled out my phone and typed a simple text message. I hope you're proud of me tonight. I finally found my seat at the table. I sent it to both of them, then walked to my car without looking back. As I drove home through the quiet streets of Portland, I thought about all the tables I'd been excluded from over the years. Family dinners where my dreams were dismissed, academic conferences where I was too young to be taken seriously, policy meetings where community voices were marginalized. But tonight, I'd sat at a table with the mayor, shared a platform with state officials, and been surrounded by community members whose lives had been changed by work I'd helped create. I'd found my place, not by conforming to someone else's expectations, but by staying true to my own values and vision. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "We saw you on stage tonight. We're proud of you." A second text followed from my father. "Maybe you can teach us about this program sometime. We'd like to understand." I smiled as I pulled into the driveway, thinking about how long I'd waited to hear those words. But the truth was, I didn't need their validation anymore. I'd found something more valuable than approval. I'd found my purpose. And that, I realized, was enough.